session, we are going to talk about how to generate successful businesses that have social, environmental, and economic impact while also being friendly to the planet. We want to make sure that we're generating businesses and still enabling life to thrive on Earth. But every day we're bombarded with bad news. You know, it's bleak news about the environment, about the climate, and it can make us feel powerless and overwhelmed. So we're here with a very optimistic viewpoint about how entrepreneurs are solving problems, and they're doing it in such a way that they're not generating new problems for tomorrow by considering the environment and also leveraging the environment to be more innovative and more successful businesses. So we have three amazing panelists that are going to talk about how doing right by the planet is also doing right by humanity and doing right by business. And they're going to provide case studies as well as frameworks and tools that will be very usable for early stage businesses and startups. So we're really excited about that. The panelists that we have today are London Davies, and I want to make sure I say this correctly, who is the Director of the Conservation Enterprise Development Program at the Wildlife Conservation Society, Javier Gondo, the Andean Region Portfolio Manager for NESsT, and Janine Elliott, who's a Program Officer at VentureWell. And how this will work is that after my introduction, we will have the panelists kind of go in sequence, London and Javier and Janine. They'll take about 10 minutes each to present information. And then all of you will have the opportunity to ask them questions. So be thinking about what you want to ask, jot down your questions. If you have questions for London right at the beginning, remember you'll have to ask them later on. That said, you can also send questions through the text chat feature. So that's another option available. And then we will also have some polls. So we want to hear from you along the way. So look for those polls as we go along, and we hope you will interact with us and tell us a little bit about yourselves. So that said, let me share with you some information about the Lemelson Foundation. Okay, so the Lemelson Foundation is committed to improving lives through invention. Our founder was Jerome Lemelson and his wife, Dorothy. They believed that invention could solve many of the biggest economic and social challenges of our time. And Jerry was actually one of the most prolific inventors in the United States in the 20th century with over 600 patents. And he wanted to ensure that the next generation of inventors had the skills and mindsets to be able to invent solutions and take those solutions to market where they could be used. So we work to strengthen the systems to enable inventions to take shape and grow and flourish, but also to nurture the people who need to create those inventions and turn them into actual viable solutions. We also know that inventing isn't easy, and inventing with entrepreneurship is incredibly challenging. So we work to facilitate the process of getting inventions out there and turning them into businesses. Over the last 20 years plus, we've given more than 200 million in funding, and that money has gone to inspiring the next generation of inventors to tackle the world's most daunting problems. It's advanced the field of invention education in both the K-12 and higher education levels, so elementary school and all the way through college, grad school. And we've worked to equip invention-based entrepreneurs with the skills and mindsets they need to start successful invention-based businesses. So I'm just trying to get to the next slide. Okay. My next slide talks about impact inventing, which is the way that we hope that inventions are ultimately created. Kind of this three-part definition of impact inventing, because we want to make sure we're not creating the new problems of tomorrow while we solve the problems of today. So we're looking to generate positive impact and environmental impact through inventions. We want these inventions to be environmentally responsible, and the businesses that are taking those inventions to market to be environmentally responsible. So considering things like materials and manufacturing, distribution, the whole life cycle, the end of life, ideally to generate more positive than negative impact, but certainly to minimize any negative environmental consequences. And then ultimately that they're financially self-sustaining inventions and businesses, because that's how those products can get used, so they don't just sit on a shelf. So that's a little bit about the Lemelson Foundation. And now we want to hear a little bit about you. So we will pop up a little poll for you to fill out that asks you what you're doing, who you are. Okay, so you should see the poll and then just select the category that you feel fits best. And take a couple seconds. Okay, we have results. Great, so we've got primarily investors and funders, about 33% of us, about 27% nonprofit professionals. A good chunk of you are entrepreneurs, 13%, so that's great to see. And then capacity providers, people who are supporting entrepreneurs, are 20%. Thank you so much for filling out that poll. Now we want to get to know your experiences in this particular topic a little bit better, so we have one more poll. Okay, so is it being environmentally friendly currently a high priority in your day-to-day personal life? Is being environmentally friendly currently a high priority in your entrepreneurial venture or in the ventures you work with? And then do you feel you have the information you need to be environmentally friendly in entrepreneurship? Get your answers in. Wow, oh my gosh, 100% of people say that it's a priority in your day-to-day personal lives. That is awesome. 73% are seeing this as a high priority in your venture or in the ventures you work with. Fantastic. But 47% of you feel like you have the information you need, and then others don't. A good chunk of you, 40%, don't feel that you have the information you need to be environmentally friendly in entrepreneurship. So this is going to be a great webinar to talk about examples of how these concepts are strengthening businesses and also leading to better improvements in our world. All right, so now we are going to start with London Davies, and she's going to talk about how business is being used in conservation and provide some thinking frameworks for you that can be really useful as you consider how you can make change through your own work.
Thank you, Cindy. Let me just share screen here. All right. So the Wildlife Conservation Society is a global conservation organization. Our mission is to save wildlife in wild places through science, through conservation action, through education, and through inspiring people to value nature. So our approach to entrepreneurship is quite niche and different in that we focus on 15 priority regions around the world and are very place-based in our approach to conservation. And our work looks at conservation targets, whether it's specific species, a landscape as a whole, and try to abate the threats to those species or landscapes, and work with communities, community livelihoods, and community businesses to try as one tool in our toolkit to affect those conservation targets. So I just wanted to, there we go, walk you through a framework that we often use when we're designing a business. So in some cases, WCS is the entrepreneur working with a community, whether it be a cooperative or a subsection of a community in one of the remote landscapes that we work in developing countries. And we really try to think through before we start a business what we're trying to achieve and how we think it'll try and achieve our conservation targets. So I have our conservation target here. As I said, that can be saving tigers in this particular landscape. That can be, making sure the forest stays standing, etc. And we're trying to positively affect that conservation target by reducing threats and or sustainably managing the natural resources in that area. And so we use what I call conservation enterprise, and some of my colleagues more extensively call sustainable community natural resource enterprises. But that's sort of a subset within conservation enterprise, looking at businesses that rely on natural resource, sustainable use of natural resources specifically. So those businesses, one is using to increase the incomes of the communities that we work with, either through greater employment income for those who are involved in the business, and or the enterprise leading to profits that the community shares through a cooperative or other similar revenue sharing mechanism. And then that income, one hopes, will lead to increased natural resource-based livelihood security. And that natural resource-based livelihood security, we assume, will lead to two things: decreasing unsustainable livelihood activities. So if you think of, one of the standard types of enterprises being clean fuel stoves, and firewood being taken out of the forest by local communities, if you give them an option where they don't have to use firewood, or they can use less firewood, you're just decreasing the likelihood that they're going to go out and cut down more trees. So reducing that threat. And then secondly, if a large share of a community relies on natural resources being sustainably managed for their livelihood, that community will be motivated to govern that resource, and that better governance would then lead to a reduction in the threat and more sustainably managed resources. And then one hopes that it becomes a virtual cycle of the resources are more sustainably managed, and therefore that resource is actually secured for that community to continue to rely on. And so the business, can harvest more of that resource sustainably over the long run. So that's sort of the general model. There are different versions of this model depending on the enterprise and the threats and the targets, but that's sort of a very common one that we use. And once we have sort of this general framework set up, we then look at, okay, we've made a lot of assumptions. Every arrow in here is an assumption. So how do we measure and confirm that those assumptions are accurate? So we try to monitor as best we can every step along the way. So looking at income, it's fairly easy to monitor the income of the enterprise, and also monitoring, individual members of the community. How has their income changed by the presence of this new enterprise? But also, different steps along the way. There are different rectangles here, trying to monitor each assumption all the way to the conservation target, where we obviously are monitoring, how many tigers are in the landscape. Is it increasing, decreasing? Is this really having an effect in the end? And so I wanted to give you one example of this type of business. It's in Nicaragua. It's a ecotourism business called Cabu Tours. And so we started with WCS working in this community on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua and the Mosquito Coast. And these communities will harvest sea turtles, both for their eggs and for the meat. They traditionally will eat the turtles. And the government of Nicaragua has come up with quotas so that these turtles aren't over-harvested. Unfortunately, WCS scientists on the ground discovered that the quotas that were legal weren't actually sustainable. So people were legally harvesting turtles in an unsustainable fashion. So on one side, WCS is lobbying the Nicaraguan government with our scientific reports, trying to get them to change that. And then on the other side, we wanted to work with the communities to make them value the live sea turtles and to decrease the total number of turtles that were being captured on an annual basis. So our objective for the enterprise was to stabilize threatened sea turtle populations. And the business model that we came up with was to work with people in the community who harvest the turtles, turtle poachers, and give them a livelihood that actually relied on the turtles being alive, which is easy to do when you see tourists coming to the area and being amazed when they get to snorkel with sea turtles. So we set up a business that's a cooperative, and that the community benefits from I think it's 5% of the profits go to a community fund for general community involvement. And the reason for that is really to get sort of broader community buy-in beyond just the families of those directly employed by the business. And we hired 10 turtle poachers or turtle harvesters to be involved in the business with a commitment that they would personally not harvest turtles anymore. And they were trained extensively for over a year in tourism operations. And a huge part of that training was not only how to do customer service and lead these tours, but was also, when you take tourists out on tours, all of the environmental impacts of that, and making sure that when they do the overnight camping tours, that nothing remains on the beach besides the footprints, which will disappear at the next high tide. So that they really had that ingrained in them from the beginning. And it's been incredibly successful with people loving these tours and loving the environmental and social impacts involved, and has helped WCS protect these turtles locally. And again, WCS monitors both turtle catches, community perceptions, obviously the revenues of the business, to ensure that year after year it's continuing to have the impact we hope for. So that's WCS's perspective, and I will pass it back to Cindy.
Great. All right, am I back? Great. So I think now, thank you so much, Lyndon. I mean, I thought it's really inspiring to hear about that, because here you are working with communities to improve things for them and for the people while saving lives of animals and helping to really make significant changes in the environment. I'm sure people have a lot of questions. So again, everyone, write down your questions and we'll ask Lyndon at the end of our presentations. And I think now we have a poll that Javier would like us to share. Okay, so you should be seeing that now. True or false? A business should start thinking about adopting green practices when they are preparing to scale. And I'm going to turn it over to Javier to discuss the question and to share what he's working on with NESsT.
Okay. There we go. So to answer the question, I first wanted to introduce you to Suritex. This is an alpaca fiber accessories and clothing social enterprise based here in Peru. They integrate the alpaca breeders into the industry value chain. The issue is that now they have a solar-based processing plant that also works with the reusing and treating the plant, the water that it processes. Oh yeah, regarding the poll results, we see that a big portion of the viewers believe that it is important to see the impact and analyze it at the beginning, to see the impact that the company and the social enterprise are doing. And well, Suritex is actually a really good example of this, because like I was mentioning, they now have they have implemented this solar-based technology, being much more friendly to the environment. But this was something that took them a while, becoming greener, implementing these green practices. They before just would buy the yarn from these two major producers here in Peru, who dominate over 90% of the industry. So this actually limited Suritex a lot because they wouldn't be able to scale because of, well, they control the prices, and also they would manage the timings and the amounts of the provision of the yarn. So this was a major challenge for them, that would actually be overcome either building their own plant, a large one like the ones from these competitors, but this would have been really capital intensive, or making a small one but with the traditional technology that would have been really inefficient and costly because of the scale. So in the end, Suritex, what they did is to implement this solar technology that actually allows them to reduce processing costs by 30%, allowing them to remain competitive in the market. So now to answer the question, yes, this is a process that might possibly be costly. In the end, it was around $300,000 to implement all the infrastructure. But this doesn't have to be implemented since day one. Suritex has been operating for over a decade, and it was just recently that they implemented this. This was an answer a response from the situation of the market, that they couldn't be really controlling their own margins. They were very limited on growth. And this is actually a response from the tool that we have developed. We see that the need of the entrepreneurs to see the whole picture regarding the whole value chain. It's a matter of landing the different processes that are involved in the whole business, not just the company, in this case Suritex, but seeing the different areas of the value chain of an industry. Like, for example, you can see here, we developed with Suritex. This is a much simpler version of the Suritex value chain. But as you can see, we listed the different activities that are involved in the whole value chain for the alpaca fiber industry. And that's how, for the manufacturing and operations part, we saw the great need of implementing this environmentally responsible technology that also allowed them to improve the cost structure. And with this particular case, Suritex has been doing the same for other areas within the value chain. For example, in general, analyzing the different sources of efficiency and the sources of impact generated by the company. In the case, for example, for the procurement, Suritex is currently working with some of the alpaqueros. They provide them with equipment because, as you can see there in red, one of the major impacts that this particular area is generating is deforestation in the highlands, because the alpaca breeders, they usually take the alpacas for around 4 to 5 days to feed from the pastures in the highlands. This actually also means a lot of cost for them. So the equipment provided by Suritex is actually to build their own vertical farms where they can grow the food. And in this way, they also improve the quality of the fiber that they are generating. So it's a good example of how analyzing the different areas of the value chain can also boost and, in this case, secure the quality of your own products. But I must confess that here we had a really big advantage, two main advantages working with Suritex. The first one being that efficiency is already within their philosophy. So it was really easy work with Suritex to land the different processes, identifying the different activities. And the second main advantage was that they already have the technical knowledge to implement all these changes. Gregor, who is the founder, he is a chemical engineer and has over 30 years of experience in the industry. He knows a lot about the different processes, the technology, how to do research. So it was very easy for him to identify alternatives for the processing and made it easier for a quicker implementation. But in the end, the purpose of this tool is actually to promote and motivate the entrepreneurs to see the whole picture. And this is what we do with Suritex and with the other companies in the portfolio. We support them on an ongoing basis, both seeing the commercial and financial areas, but at the same time analyzing and reevaluating the process. But going back to the tool, the first stage is to go into a deep dive of the value chain and identifying the different processes involved in the whole value chain, and with that identifying the sources of impact and also of efficiency, so that these two can be aligned. And then the entrepreneurs would go and do the survey and get results like you can see in the screen, so that you can identify where in the value chain a lot of work could be done or that can be prioritized. And after this, you get access to a presentation where you can access different pieces of literature and materials with examples of what companies in the world are doing or common practices. But at the end, the actual plan on how your company can become greener and adopt greener practices is really something that the entrepreneur and any capacity providers and partners need to do along the way. It's a really deep dive on your own business. In the end, the purpose of the tool is to inspire and motivate the entrepreneurs to really see on a case-by-case basis what you can do, is to motivate and promote you to research, identify these different areas, and see how you can implement these different practices while also securing your own self-sustainability. In the end, at NEST, we really see that social enterprises are actually gaining a more important role within promoting self-sustainability and conservation. In the end, social enterprises that we work with usually offer a product that revalues the biodiversity, while at the same time establishing a truly self-sustainable business model that can also go and coexist with the environment. This is why we decided to build this tool so we can measure this, and that is why we are constantly working with social enterprises, evaluating different alternatives, and seeking ways of improving and helping the companies. So I wanted to go back to Cindy. There we go.
Thank you. That's excellent, Javier. So you took us through an example and a tool, and some of the things I took out of that is that example clearly demonstrated how doing something that was more environmentally friendly through the solar panels, through a technology, saved the business money, enabled them to be actually competitive. So it can strengthen the business performance, can strengthen the business's resilience, which is awesome, and that's what we need. And it aligned with the values of the leaders of that organization. It's a social enterprise, and so being environmentally responsible also reflects what they want to do in the world, which is fantastic. And then thank you for taking us through a quick demo of that tool and showing us how you can think about these questions all along the value chain of your business, and that it doesn't have to just be something that you do at the start of the business. In fact, an established company can take these tools and look at opportunities to make change, as they're getting ready to scale. So it's a great tool in terms of that entire spectrum of where you might be with your organization stage, and that's great to see. So speaking of great tools, I know Janine will be presenting some other practical approaches and resources that can be used. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her for her presentation. Keep your questions going. Oh, and before Janine goes, one thing I wanted to remind people is that as you're looking at the PowerPoints, if the videos, if you see our faces covering PowerPoints, you can minimize that. So Natalie mentioned that before, but as a reminder, you can click on those videos to make them get out of your way. Thanks.
Program officer here at VentureWell, and I am excited to be here on the call today. So just a little bit of background with VentureWell in the context of our fellow panelists here today. Our big focus is around science and technology ventures that are in a position to create impact specifically through those inventions that they're creating. And so in that process, we realized when we were working with our different stakeholders, we work with students in higher education, we work with faculty members that are doing research that they're interested in bringing out into the field. And we're also working with innovators and different people at all levels globally in this area of science and technology for impact. We decided that it might be a good idea to add to this suite of opportunities and tools for being able to talk about how beyond just that impact that somebody might have with their given technology, how can they think more holistically about that? So really echoing what Cindy was saying at the beginning around that idea of impact inventing or triple bottom line thinking with people, planet, and profit. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And when we were working with our constituents around these issues, it was really striking that similarly to what we just saw in this poll, we had a situation in which 70% of the innovators we work with who work in everything from designing and creating medical devices and medical diagnostics, all the way up through clean technologies and water technologies globally, 70% of them thought that sustainability things in their daily life were really important. They buy organic, they turn off the lights, they carpool, they conserve water. But among these students and innovators that are coming from primarily technical backgrounds, 60% had not actually considered those environmental impacts of their design or of their businesses in terms of how they were applying that technical knowledge and whether or not they were still going with those value sets along the way. And so it was interesting to see that on the poll today, everyone has this as a high priority in their own lives, but this question of how it aligns with their work or the ventures that they're supporting, or feeling like you have the tools you need, how can we start thinking more holistically about that? So this set of tools that I'm going to be introducing are primarily for the people who maybe have the value set but don't really know where to start, and also for the people who already are excited about this. And now there's this question of how do you really make the case and how do you find ways to get others excited and involved in taking action, particularly with technology-based or product-based types of businesses. So you'll see some echoes from what Javier was just describing in terms of that value chain of Suritex. So one of the items that is available is called the Inventing Green Guide, a toolkit for sustainable design. And this is a free downloadable PDF guide that includes some notes so that if you are a capacity provider, a nonprofit, an accelerator, and you're interested in getting other people excited about this, there's some tools or tips around how you might facilitate around using this guide. There's a short narrative component. This is the green guide that talks about the business case for a lot of these things. So to that point of, no turtles, no ecotourism business, that London brought up, these are the kinds of things that you can get a better sense of in terms of making the business case. And then the self-assessment piece is similar to what Javier's group has done, but is much more for the people at that ideation stage or that very, very initial product design stage, so that they can really bake in those changes from the beginning, as opposed to necessarily waiting until they're bigger and stronger and have more leverage down the line. So in some ways, it's more of an ideation tool. And what was interesting when our innovators took that self-assessment after having read the Green Guide and engaging in the materials, 60% found new opportunities to tweak their products or tweak how they were thinking about their sourcing, manufacturing, distribution, reverse logistics, so that they could amplify their impacts across areas that they hadn't even considered, while maintaining efficiencies or even gaining efficiencies along the way. And so for some people who maybe are skeptics, or there's also that opportunity to just even get them thinking about the different ways that this can look, we also produced a video series that's available on YouTube with these different cases, similarly to that London and Javier have described, in terms of how different ventures, everything from building materials in the concrete reinforcement business up through water treatment and sanitation and agricultural services. There are a bunch of really great little instructional case studies to get those creative juices flowing if you're not sure how you fit into this, or if you're working with people who maybe aren't so sure about all this. And all of those are available on the VentureWell website in the Inventing Green Toolkit section. Now, what was interesting about rolling this out with people who had the high value sets and were already sort of sold on the ideas, they said, well, I really want to take action. And so how do I select the most appropriate materials? Or how do I make this case that a lighter weight product is actually going to have the reduced carbon emissions that I say they will? And so we worked with a faculty member who has worked extensively in green design and green engineering, who has worked with Stanford and UC Berkeley and Dartmouth. And it was interesting to see that in this case, we were able to build out more of those tools for when you're really ready to spring into action and really looking for ways to make that difference. So this self-guided course materials are all things that, again, are free and available, and it involves tutorials, that's the content piece, exercises, so actually applying this to yourself, and then also some examples if, again, you're looking for a little bit of inspiration. And so it has these great little video tutorials that were actually produced by Autodesk, and they're letting us use them as a part of this suite of materials. And then it even just really includes these really detailed, how do I pick sustainable wood for the specs that I really need in order to run the business that's going to be most effective for my constituents? And so it's an interesting question that helps people to really start digging into this and taking action as they're thinking about their product designs in particular. Now, we also don't want to leave out the people who are working more so on the services side, or thinking about the distribution channels, the logistics, the reverse logistics, and the more of the business side, whether it's a product or a service. And it was really exciting to find out that a group called the Presidio Graduate School took over an opportunity to rethink how the business model canvas could be used as a way to really frame this question of how to amplify the positive impact on not only profit, but also people and the planet. And so they created something called the Business Sustainability Booster. And they did the same framework of looking at all 9 of the boxes that are on the business model canvas, for those of you who are familiar with it. And each category has these opportunities to ask new questions about mitigating unforeseen impacts that are negative, while also looking at how maybe new customer segments could be opened up if they just tweaked their messaging or tweaked their pricing or tweaked how they were thinking about distribution to be as human-centric and customer-centric as possible. And this is also something that's free down at that presidio.edu/booster. And this is something that you can download. You can print it on some nice cardstock. And it's actually meant to be basically this big deck of cards that helps you work through these different ways that you can modify your business model for both that maximum impact, but also that maximum business opportunity. So at this point, I want to turn it back over to Cindy to moderate our larger discussion. And yeah, I'm happy to be a resource. I'm happy to dive into more examples as needed, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much. So again, a set of resources that can be easily brought into either companies that you're working with or into your own business. And you can go ahead and use those free resources, download them, go online. You know, we hope that these tools are things that you will take a look at if you're thinking about doing these things. And so hopefully they're really easy and accessible for you. And I know that we shared with the registrants of this conversation a link so that you can easily find them, and it's probably something we can follow up with at the end as well. And Janine and I have actually presented these tools before. VentureWell is a grantee of Lemelson, as is NESsT, and I know from presentations that we've done previously that people get really excited about using these tools because they were specifically designed to help, you know, early stage ventures solve these issues, which is kind of a gap that we saw in the world of resources to think about environmental impact, both in terms of the products, like the things, as well as services and the business models to get them to people. So now we do have time for questions, and we had a question here from Genesis come in through the chat, and we can go ahead and look at this first question. All right, so it is Janine or one of the other panelists. What are some examples of metrics you use to quantify your environmental impact? You want to take that, Janine?
So I'll start, and then actually I might even take it on over to other panelists here, because when we created especially that questionnaire and the green guide piece, it actually turned out that the diversity of ventures that we were supporting on the technical side were so different that in many ways it's even the pre-metrics collection stage in terms of just thinking about the possible leverage points that might exist. So in many ways it was more that question of which type of wood might you select that could be more sustainably sourced than others, or to what extent can you rely on local labor systems than importing everything to your target customers. So in that sense, it turned out that a lot of the materials that we created were much more qualitative and subjective, depending on the use case that the innovators found. But so in that sense, I'm curious to turn it over to Javi or London in terms of that next step of saying, great, they've ideated on it, now they're really committing to moving forward on what's really going to matter to them. What are some of those metrics you guys like to use?
Okay, well, Lon, you want to follow, or can I?
If you have something to say, go ahead.
Okay, no, thanks. Like in the case of Janine, I think that at least for the first stage and for using the Inventing Green tool, it goes to the general view of, okay, what are the general resources that you're using, and identifying the sources of potential negative impact to the environment. And from there, the companies pass to the next stage. When we're working closely with them, we find different ways of measuring that. For example, the general view would be, okay, so for the processes, we would be using regular fuel. So there you can go deeper into that process and see how much you're using, and also either doing some experimentation or seeing research that is done all over the world to measure, oh, how much CO2, for example, is being generated from that process. For example, we have a company in the portfolio called Café Compadre that they have developed a solar roaster for roasting the coffee, and both because they actually are more efficient regarding energy use, but they also measure they have also made experiments to measure how much CO2 the processing of, well, the roasting of the coffee with solar energy generates, because it still generates a little bit. But it's reducing the regular process by around 90% of the CO2 emitted. But it's something that the entrepreneurs were actually very eager to learn how to do the experiments, research about different working papers all over the world, and see how they would do. I think a similar approach could be done with different sources of pollution or of waste.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add, other than sort of what I touched on earlier. And Javier sort of also mentioned, is really focusing on customizing the metrics to the business rather than trying to have a portfolio-wide metric approach. I think in some cases you have to have that, and in our specific case, we focus on sustainably managed hectares, for example, because so much of our work involves sustainable agriculture, and price premium a producer might receive is one of the more standard ones. But really the focus has been, what is our target environmentally or from a conservation perspective, and what is the biggest impact environmentally that the business has, whether it's, uses a lot of water or energy or what have you, trying to minimize that biggest footprint of the business has been those are the two foci that we have.
Great, thank you both. Yeah, I think one of the frameworks, one of the processes that people sometimes use is the Lifecycle assessment tool, and that is referenced in some of the resources I know in VentureWell's resources. So, but the important thing is figuring out what is it that you're, what's the change you're seeking, and so what do you need to know in order to demonstrate that you are achieving the goals that you've set out, or that company has set out, and each case is going to be different. All right, we have a couple of more questions that have come in. Remember, you can send these. You can use the Q&A tool, the chat tool. One is, when going green doesn't immediately make you price competitive, how do you go about reaching customers that can pay the premium? Anybody have experience with that scenario, with actually building in like a value add or a higher price and reaching target customers who can absorb that?
Yeah, I can address that. I mean, I think that is the solution, finding the customers that can pay the premium. A lot of times, we talk about, a fair trade or Rainforest Alliance certification. In many cases with the businesses that we work with, that in of itself the cost of certification don't quite make up, sadly, the difference in the price they receive. And that's where sort of having a really good story and being able to tell the story, so that it's not just, a basic certification, but an ability to do the marketing and to try and identify, where those consumers are and reach them as directly as possible, skipping middlemen in the value chain so that story can be heard is what we've focused on.
And actually, if I could even just add an alternative perspective to that, or to the question that I think really does come up in terms of that relationship of price competitiveness. A lot of it has to do with what business you're in and what industry you're in. So if you're in a consumer products business or the tourism business, where maybe there are segments of people that are really excited to pay a premium. You know, there's the group in marketing lingo, LOHAS, the lifestyle of health and sustainability market segment. And these are typically the people that are willing to pay more for that story, for the impact that they're looking to have in their daily lives. I know that for myself, a lot of the innovators I'm working with, strangely enough, are making very, very specialty products, but they're getting so deep into the value chain that consumer story doesn't really matter. It's a commodity at the end of the day for a lot of these people. And so for them, especially when they're really early stage and they're not at that point maybe where they have the leverage at scale, a lot of the time what we're doing with them is seeing where they can stay price competitive and where it might not actually be about the messaging of being green, but it's more about identifying those operational efficiencies or finding the places where less waste is happening or more value is captured so that the price doesn't have to change. And I know that that's not going to apply to everybody, but in some industries where the price is just not going to be negotiable, that's also a strategy where maybe people start small with just a few leverage points that really build efficiency and then go from there.
All right, well, thank you very much for those thoughts. We probably have time for one, maybe two more questions. We have a question from Renata who's asking about the tools that we've talked about and if you can speak to barriers that entrepreneurs have experienced using those tools. Maybe Javier, Janine.
Yeah, well, I can start. So in our case, like I mentioned in the example for Suritex, we felt that the great advantage that we had with them was the alignment of their own philosophy, that they were very focused on efficiency. So it's a matter also of seeing the way where the two, both the green practices and the efficiency can work aligned. And the second one was that Gregor, the founder, has a really good technical background and a lot of experience there. So it is one of the things that might be a great limitation with the entrepreneurs, having that technical knowledge, whether if it's inside the company or through advisors, mentors, or partners that can advise them on what technologies there are, how they could implement, how the different processes work. I think that's a major barrier, but I think that's one of the things that the company and the founders and the whole management team and supporters need to help view and analyze and see how to cover that gap. So I would say those have been the two main limitations to keep the entrepreneurs aligned with the tools and keep working with them.
Yeah, and I can just add in terms of what we've noticed in terms of user experience with our tools is sometimes in the self-assessment in particular, innovators will get caught up on the scoring mechanism of on a scale of 1 to 5, where do you fall in terms of this level of importance? And they'll get really upset that their score isn't high based on the questions that are being asked. And so the one thing I just really suggest is to not get discouraged and use those questions and use that scale more so as a way to communicate with colleagues or peers about where you might want to go strategically and what is most important strategically for the business. Just because it might be too early to really be able to start measuring those outputs and outcomes yet. And so in that sense, that's probably the place where I've seen the most frustration with using that quiz that we had created. But I think as long as you set those expectations ahead of time, it can still be a really effective way to at least start the conversation.
Great. Yeah, so some great thoughts there. Certainly, yeah, you may not have all of the resources at hand on the founding team. You can, look for others who can help, mentors, Javier mentioned. So all great thoughts. We have a question here about, how as a consumer can you do due diligence to ensure that what people are claiming about their impact is real versus just something that they're saying. And so one thought that I would share is, things like B Corp certification. Typically, though, you have to be an established company to be able to qualify to get certified, but that's a pretty stringent, way of qualifying companies because there is a lot of due diligence involved, and an organization is actually verifying that what the company claims is true, and the bar for actually qualifying is decently high. So you can learn more about that and look at companies that have sought that certification. At the earlier stages, Javi mentioned that if a consumer wants to do a lot of research on the actual people involved in that organization, that can be a good way to figure out whether there seems to be true alignment between the claims and founders represent what they believe, what they would actually want to do in the world. Curious if anyone has other suggestions, particularly for companies that maybe can't get that stamp of approval yet from outside certifiers. I mean, certainly we've all heard of fair trade and all kinds of different labels and certifications, and it depends on what kind of company you have and what you qualify for. But those are some quick thoughts before we wrap up. Anyone else have something burning to share on that final question? Okay. Well, we have one more set of questions for our audience. As we pull up that final poll, today, as a reminder, we've talked about how inventors and entrepreneurs are not only improving life on Earth, but actually saving lives on Earth. So really fascinating to hear from London about those efforts. And then Javi spoke about how environmental considerations can make a company more innovative, more cost competitive, more attractive, more resilient. And then, everyone has shared frameworks and tools, and Janine did a great exploration of, how you can go about doing this and what resources are available. And Javi also mentioned the NESsT tool for doing that as well. So we hope that you have found some ideas, tools, that you think will be useful for you, some examples that are inspiring. And we want to pull up one more poll here. So let us know what's something that you might take as a result of this, an action you might take as a result of this webinar. Do you think you might want to learn more about the tools? Maybe reach out to one of the speakers. Explore more examples of entrepreneurs. Janine mentioned the videos that showcase examples, and you can find many more online. Or maybe nothing. Maybe this was, just a point in time and you got what you needed, or something else. All right, we're just waiting for those quick results. Great. So glad to hear that people want to go and take a look at those tools. And we also want to encourage you, if you have additional questions, you want to reach out to the speakers. There'll be some follow-up by NESsT, and we would certainly welcome more questions and opportunity to engage. Looks like a lot of you are also interested in looking at examples of how entrepreneurs are integrating this thinking. So 64% want to look at the tools, 50% want to explore more examples. So I really hope that this has been helpful, and I appreciate everyone's engagement and awesome questions. So thanks again. Thanks to all our amazing speakers. Thank you to NESsT. Thank you, Natalie. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.